The Healthcare Labyrinth podcast is back for another episode. Join Mark S. Ryan, a veteran health plan and health technology executive, as he explores the world of healthcare.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. My name is Mark Ryan, and it's a pleasure to be hosting the podcast. And thanks to everyone for listening in. We are going to continue with a little more about what's going to happen in 2025 on healthcare reductions. I've had a series of podcasts and blogs out there. Let me talk about a couple of podcasts you may want to go back to. I mentioned these earlier. On January 17th, I had a podcast on the first 100 days of Trump and how a lot of activity was going on. We had confirmations, the debt limit, the CR, and budget reconciliation and DOGE, and a whole lot more happening. And you can go back to that January 17th podcast at healthcarelabyrinth.com, the podcast tab, or at leading podcast tabs and sites to listen to that January 17th, first 100 days of Trump, because it sort of sets out the framework for mechanically how things will really work in Congress and how the administration and the GOP Congress will work together. Then on February 7th, actually last week, we did talk about the list of cuts that have been sort of published out there. And these could be the healthcare cuts that would go into any budget reconciliation bill. Now, when we did that podcast, we said we're not quite sure how much will be in that bill, how many cuts to healthcare there will be. But I wanted to lay it out for you and show you all the possible cuts that could occur in that budget reconciliation bill, principally because the president and GOP leaders want to essentially re-up and extend the 2017 tax cuts. And that takes hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars over time in pay-fors. So go to that February 7th podcast again, either at healthcarelabyrinth.com, the podcast tab, or leading podcast apps and sites, February 7th, to hear about the list of cuts that could be on the table for any budget reconciliation bill. This podcast is really going to cover now everything that has happened really since about a month ago. We're almost a month into the President Trump returning to office, but in the last 4 to 6 weeks, there have been some significant developments in terms of where Trump and the GOP Congress may go on how deep healthcare cuts may be, as well as is there going to be major restructuring. So we're going to start off here. We're going to take our normal 3 breaks and break it into roughly 4 parts. But what I'm going to do here is reflect on 6 trends that we've seen over the last month to 6 weeks regarding cuts to healthcare that have been talked about by either President Trump or lawmakers in Congress. And it will give you a little bit of a feel for the volatility. And then we're going to sort of conclude with sort of where I think things could go. Again, a little bit is up in the air about this because we don't know exactly where they will go on these cuts. So again, sort of this podcast is, will Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, as an example, see huge cuts? My main premise here in the podcast is that while cuts will occur, things could be looking a bit better for Medicaid and the exchanges. Again, nothing is definitive here, and we'll talk about that in the conclusion, but things could be looking a little bit better for Medicaid and the exchanges based on what's transpired in the last 4 to 6 weeks. So I have come up with about 6 sort of interesting developments that might mean a better outcome on healthcare cuts than we thought before. So let's get right to it here. The first one is I want to reiterate about the tight vote count in each House of Congress and how that's already proving to be challenging to the GOP leaders and the president. Part of my prediction that a massive remake of healthcare would not occur is the fact, again, that each chamber in Congress has very tight vote counts. The Senate has 53 Republicans. The House GOP won 220 seats, but soon dropped to as low as 217 due to vacancies as Congresspeople joined the Trump administration. It will take up to 6 months to get back to 220. These tight margins for control of chambers are largely unprecedented in the past. Even with the full complement in the House, GOP leaders in each chamber can lose no more than 2 or 3 members on a bill to pass legislation. We have already seen the tight counts hobble Republicans' agenda. Prior to the new Congress, the House GOP did not initially have votes to pass a continuing resolution for federal fiscal year 2025. It had to settle for a short-term solution through March 14th. The House GOP, too, had problems gaining enough votes to re-elect Speaker Mike Johnson. Over in the Senate, Vice President J.D. Vance had to cast a tie-breaking vote to confirm the nomination of Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. The need to address funding federal fiscal year 25 and the debt limit soon could display more fractures in the GOP bloc. I suspect these dynamics will continue to play out throughout 2025. So with that, I think we'll take our first break here with that very first item introduced, and we'll come back to continue on some of the trends that may make things better in terms of limiting healthcare cuts and coverage impacts. Be right back.
Health plans and insurance are confusing. Our healthcare system is in dire need of reform. Health policy expert Mark Ryan tackles both issues in his book, The Healthcare Labyrinth. It is both a guide to navigating health plans and fixing American health insurance. Mark dives deep into how health plans and the American health insurance system operate. He then outlines a comprehensive reform agenda for the system as a whole, including pricing, emphasizing health and care management, and ensuring affordable access to health coverage in a private delivery model. Mark is a bit of an unconventional Republican in that he believes affordable access is the morally right thing to do, and that it is also fiscally prudent for our nation. Learn more about Mark's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at healthcarelabyrinth.com or search at leading bookseller websites. Available in print, ebook, and audiobook forms.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We're talking about how things may be looking a little bit better in terms of healthcare cuts based on about 6 developments over the past 4 to 6 weeks here. So we're going to cover 2 more before our next break. So related to the item we talked about right before the break, having to do with tight vote counts in each house, there are moderates in each house that are going to hold great sway on healthcare issues. GOP moderates in the Senate are Senators Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. Both of them have a very strong moderate and independent streak. They are among my favorite senators for their deliberation, thoughtfulness, and moderation. They both are supporters of healthcare programs. Murkowski has already signaled her desire to extend enhanced premium subsidies for the exchanges. The 2 of them voted against Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, so you can see how they do have this very independent streak. There, too, in the Senate are some pragmatic GOP conservative senators who worry about too much government change. So again, beyond Murkowski and Collins, there are these small number of folks that are more conservative in the GOP in the Senate who do have some concerns. While they likely fall in line with Trump ultimately, they could side with the moderates at critical points during the budget reconciliation process and things like that. You also have the wild card of Mitch McConnell, the former Senate Republican leader. He is no longer constrained as a leader of the GOP and is unlikely to run again in 2026. McConnell very much loathes Donald Trump. While McConnell is a conservative, he will not fall into line easily on some of these more controversial issues. As an example, he voted against Hegseth too. So those are sort of the moderates and moderate forces that could impact healthcare votes in the Senate. Let's move over to the House now. The House has a core group of about 2 to 3 dozen moderates that tend to favor slightly more expansive government programs than other Republicans in the House. This group slightly eroded in the 2024 election as Democrats took back some of these districts. There is another group of compromise conservatives who dislike obstructionism. The compromised conservatives are more likely to fall into line on Trump's agenda again, but some of them, along with the moderates in the House, will push back on a major dismantling of healthcare programs. So that's number 2, sort of the moderate influencers out there that could form obstacles to radical healthcare cuts. Let's move on to the third issue here. This, again, is related to the tight vote count and the moderates that may hold sway. And this is sort of the issue of swing districts and the already upcoming 2026 elections, because House members, for example, have to run every 2 years. So again, there is an overlap between moderates and swing districts as well. But it's not always the case that moderates are in swing districts. You could have more conservative members there as well. But anyway, in 2024, there were over 40 House seats that were rated sort of swing. They were toss-ups or lean Democrat or lean Republican toward the end of the campaign. With control of the House being just a few votes, the GOP will be especially worried about controversial votes that could impact seats in 2026. This will happen at the individual lawmaker level, a GOP winner in 24 who's worried about keeping his seat in 2026, but also among some of the leaders. The leaders will worry about how do they maintain control. These swing district Republicans remember what happened in the 2018 election after many of them sided with Trump to repeal the ACA. So there's a effect out there that occurred in 2018 that is on people's minds again. They lost control of the House. Many of these swing members lost their races in the 2018 election after they teamed up with Trump and other Republicans to seek to repeal the ACA. Moderates and swing district Republicans have already sent word to leaders in the House and Senate that they do not want major healthcare changes because they support a reasonable safety net and fear, again, election consequences in 2026, similar to what happened in 2018. Remember, too, that both Susan Collins, a moderate, and Thom Tillis, a more pragmatic conservative, are in battleground elections in 2026 for the Senate. In my mind, the best case scenario for the GOP is that it could grow its majority in the 26 elections from 53 to 55. But worst case, it appears they could drop to 51 votes if they lose Collins and if they lose Tillis. The GOP wants to stay in control of the upper chamber after they just got it back in the 2024 elections, and the GOP needs to protect its majority for 26 and 28, which could be another big year as well because it's a presidential election year. So with the first 3 items covered, essentially tight vote counts in each house, moderates having some sway here, and the swing district in the 2026 elections already being around the corner, all of which will impact healthcare. We'll take our second break and come back to cover more potential issues that influence healthcare reduction outcomes. Be right back.
Lilac Software is proud to work with the Healthcare Labyrinth website to educate people on the healthcare system. At Lilac, we believe transparency is so important in healthcare. The healthcare system is opaque, and Lilac is trying to bring clarity to data and unleash the best member care, reduce costs, and improve outcomes. Our cloud-native payer platform revolutionizes data insights and analytics. Plans have all the data they need, but in silos locked away in point solutions. At Lilac, we solve the data fragmentation problem and help plans turn complex data into actionable insights, leading to greater operating leverage, tight cost controls, and healthier members. Health plans can improve STAR scores, reduce medical expense, drive revenue, and more. Quite simply, with Lilac, you can drive better business and health outcomes. Learn more at lilacsoftware.com.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We're talking about healthcare cuts that could go into the budget reconciliation process in 2025 and why things might be looking a little better based on some trends and happenings in the last 4 to 6 weeks. So again, we've covered some core issues that we called out. Number one, the tight vote count in each house, how moderates will be able to hold some sway over healthcare cuts, and how swing district members in the GOP will be concerned about passing anything too radical because they're up for election in 2026. So let's keep moving on here to 3 more trends here that we'll cover. So the first item is what's known as the Doctor Caucus and the potential for provider influence over healthcare cuts. This group of doctor caucuses also overlap with swing districts and moderates and compromisers and pragmatists, but it sort of has its own trends here too. So the so-called GOP doctors caucuses are about 11 members in the House and 4 in the Senate. This group can be especially sensitive to the impact of healthcare program reductions on providers because they were or still are practicing physicians. Some of these doctors also have been associated with hospitals and are very tight with local hospitals in their district. Both the American Medical Association, the AMA, and the American Hospital Association, the AHA, as well as other provider lobbies on Capitol Hill, do have great influence in general, but especially on the Doctors Caucus. The lobbies have convinced these lawmakers in the past that significant contraction of coverage in Medicaid and the exchanges endangers providers and critical healthcare assets in the community, such as hospitals. Here's a good example of that phenomenon. Rep. Greg Murphy, who is a Republican from North Carolina, is now the co-chair of the GOP Doctors Caucus in the House. He has already stated that he wants to see cuts focus on reforming eligibility abuse, fraud, waste, and abuse, Medicare Advantage overpayments, pharmacy benefit manager reforms, and dealing with the cost related to big healthcare firms. He is not calling for major coverage contraction in Medicaid or the ACA per se. He also wants a permanent Medicare physician rate fix. So you can see how these doctors, being providers and tied potentially to hospitals, could have tremendous impact on the scope and the types of healthcare reductions that could emerge in the package that moves forward in budget reconciliation. Let's next move on to another item which I call states' influence. Another major influence factor here could be state governments. Many of the proposed restructuring initiatives would impact the budgets and resource needs of states. In essence, they would essentially move the costs over to the states over time away from the federal government. Reshaping Medicaid and the ACA, including block grants and per capita cap programs, would devolve responsibility and shift financial risk to the states. Other proposals would do the same. These include reducing the Medicaid reimbursement floor, reducing Medicaid expansion funding, reducing Medicaid administrative reimbursement, and capping federal Medicaid dollars going to expanded benefits and populations in benefit and coverage-rich states. There's no question that states would weigh in on all of these potential healthcare cutbacks that have been mentioned out there and appeal to both Democrats and Republicans in their congressional delegations to resist major changes that hurt state budgets and coverage in states. You can already see some of that starting to occur between states and their congressional delegations. So let's move on to our last or our sixth major trend that we've seen in the last 4 to 6 weeks, and I call it Trump is sensitive to his legacy and signals sympathy on healthcare at different points. So again, there is this wild card of Trump himself. There is no doubting Trump wants his 2017 tax cuts extended. Further, he clearly wants to remake government and cut bloat. That's why he created the so-called Department of Government Efficiency Commission. Along with the border, these are his overwhelming goals. But Trump also is sensitive to his legacy and wishes to avoid the missteps he made in his first term. And so far, Trump has looked more moderate on healthcare issues than in the past. Admittedly, during the campaign and even now, he continues to go back and forth on many healthcare issues. But since taking office, this is what he has said on healthcare issues. In the election, he said Medicare and Social Security would not be touched, and he has reiterated this stance since taking office. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services issued a statement supporting the continuation of Medicare drug price negotiations. That was a bit of a shocker. This was a huge blow to Big Pharma, as well as rightists in Congress who want to repeal the law. And now, just on late January, Trump promised to, quote, love and cherish Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And I want to point out that Medicaid made it to the earlier list of just Social Security and Medicare in terms of protected programs. Trump said, quote, we're not going to do anything with that, meaning Medicaid, unless we can find some abuse or waste. The people won't be affected. It will only be more effective and better. Is this a sea change for Trump? Perhaps, but let's not get too hopeful from just one press statement so far. So with that, we've covered sort of our 6 emerging trends over the last month to 6 weeks. We'll take our last break now, and we'll come back for a conclusion. Be right back.
The Healthcare Labyrinth is no ordinary website. It features news and commentary from one of the nation's leading healthcare policy and technology experts. Mark Ryan combs the internet for the latest healthcare news and publishes a news feed each weekday with summations and Mark's insights. Twice a week, Mark publishes a blog to go deep into a current issue. And of course, Mark hosts a podcast each week to delve even further. All of this is available at healthcarelabyrinth.com. Visit each day for the latest happenings in healthcare. As well, learn more about Mark's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at the website. That's healthcarelabyrinth.com, your go-to source for healthcare news.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We're talking about the fact that there are certain trends and signals out there that maybe healthcare cuts won't be as bad as we think they are, and a major restructuring won't occur. But I do want to, in this conclusion, add a bit of a word of caution here. We know that Trump can turn on a dime when it comes to policy positions, and we are not in the heat of the tax cut extension pressure. So nothing yet is by any means certain. So here's a negative scenario to look out for. The stars could align to allow the GOP to convince enough lawmakers to support some rather major healthcare reductions and restructuring. Leaders could muscle through a reconciliation bill. it is fair to say that the GOP frenzy to extend the 2017 tax cuts could well take precedence over potential fallout in the 26 elections and concerns over healthcare coverage. Further, many of the rightist GOP House members, usually from safe districts, have put forward an aggressive cost-cutting agenda with a great deal focused on remaking government healthcare programs. They have assembled a list of trillions of dollars of cuts in healthcare that do remake Medicaid and the ACA, as well as would impact coverage greatly. These rightists have a visceral reaction to the mention of the ACA or Medicaid. It is part of their DNA to want to rip apart the programs. Trump's recent love and cherish remarks about Medicaid put him at odds with the rightists here. So the battle of the rightists, a bigger bloc, against more moderate forces, a much smaller one, is just beginning, and we shall see who wins out in the next several months. Could a grand compromise be reached? Are there enough spending reductions across the board in healthcare that don't impact Americans' coverage, as Trump signaled, and avoids major program restructuring, but also provides the funds that are needed for the tax cut extension dictated by budget reconciliation rules? It is hard to imagine, but if it were to occur, it would mean sweeping payment reform on health plans, PBMs, hospitals, and providers, including likely the adoption of sweeping site-neutral payments in Medicare for hospitals. Thus, a grand compromise would have to sway the same moderates, pragmatists, compromisers, and physicians in the Congress to go the route of deep provider cuts rather than coverage cuts. So in conclusion, we are in for quite the healthcare policy roller coaster ride in 2025. With that, we'll conclude this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast and see you next time. Take care.
Thanks for joining Mark and the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. Go to healthcarelabyrinth.com each day for the latest healthcare news. See you next week on the next Healthcare Labyrinth podcast.